So welcome to this sermon video. I'm Sandra Eldridge, I'm the Diocesan Environment Officer, and I'm going to be talking about the season of creation. And because I'm talking about the season of creation, I've decided that the best thing might be to do that outside. So I'm at the Greenbelt Christian Arts Festival, and you can't hear the festival or see the tents, they're down that way, and it's a lovely, bright, sunny evening here. So the theme of the season of creation this year is Let Justice and Peace Roll. I'm going to come back to that, but let's just have a moment of silence before we start. So, no one likes bad news, do they? News of a death, disaster, it's not nice. But what if the bad news is about something that is going to happen in the future? And what if it's about somebody that you love? My father died young of cancer, and he had symptoms, and then he got a diagnosis. And when he got that diagnosis, he wrote to all his children saying how proud he was of us, but also saying what the diagnosis had been and explaining how he was going to conduct the rest of his life. And then he said absolutely nothing else about it. That was his way of dealing with it. And we were very grateful to have another 2 years, which we enjoyed with him. But what would have happened if he'd had minor symptoms, no diagnosis, and yet he kept on telling us that he was going to die? We might have been annoyed, we might have been upset. Certainly our reaction would have been different. And in our gospel reading today, that's the situation that we see that Peter is in. Jesus has started to tell his disciples that he's going to suffer and he's going to die. And so at one point, Peter says, Jesus, just come over here. You can't keep telling the disciples that. You're upsetting them. There's no evidence that this is going to happen. And anyway, you know that we wouldn't let you die. And what does Jesus say? Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. It's probably the sharpest rebuke in the New Testament to the disciples. And I wonder why Jesus does that. And I think he does it because he can see something that Peter and the other disciples can't see. Jesus knows the truth. And if you're a parent, you'll know there are situations, when your child steps off the curb or something like that, where there's no room for debate and discussion. You simply don't want them to do that thing. And in this situation that Peter was in with Jesus, Jesus knows there's no room for discussion here. This is what is going to happen. And we know that in our world at the moment, we're in a pretty bad way. But I want to tell you a little bit about my mother before I continue with that. So neither of my parents were religious. And when I was talking to the Diocesan Director of Ordinands about ordination, there came a point where she said to me, she was very perceptive, she said, Sandra, is there somebody you haven't told? And I said, yes, I haven't told my mother. So I asked my mother if she'd come out to lunch with me. I bought her lunch, and in the middle of the conversation, I said to her, Mum, I've got something to tell you. I've decided to explore ordination in the Church of England. And she said to me, I know. And I said, how do you know? She said, well, I knew you would do this. You're my daughter. I'm your mother. And sometimes the people close to us can see things that we can't see. And if you're going to ask anybody about the creation, about the earth and what's happening, who would be the people that you would go to? Well, wouldn't it be naturalists like David Attenborough and Chris Packham? Because they've spent their lives looking at creation, at earth, at its creatures. And they would say, the world is in trouble. Those are the very words that David Attenborough uses. But perhaps worse than that, the scientists would tell us that actually it's not just bad, but the bad news is that if we don't do something about it, it's going to get worse. So to start to think about that and unpack it a little bit more, since I'm at Greenbelt, I've asked a fellow Greenbelter and long-term climate campaigner, Geoff, to join me, and I'm going to ask Geoff a few questions. So Geoff, I know that the story of how you got really involved in climate campaigning starts with a bit of bad news for you and a bit of personal bad news. Can you tell us what that was?
I had a phone call from the technician who used to be my lab technician at school a year after I retired, and she said, "Was that your daughter on the television?" "Why?" "Because she's been arrested." And that was something of a shock.
And what was your reaction to that?
Well, I wanted to know why she'd been arrested, and the explanation was she was one of 29 people who'd stopped a train delivering coal to Drax power station. And my reaction was disappointment, anger, frustration. "Beth," I said to her, "how dare you take the law into your own hands? We've brought you up to come to church. I'm a teacher, for goodness sake. You have to keep the law."
And what did she say back to you?
Her reply to me was, "Dad, haven't you heard of climate change?" And my response was, "Excuse me, I was the science teacher. I know all about climate change." And her response to that was, "But Dad, it's urgent." In a couple of days after that, she had an article published in The Guardian that said, "The Earth will warm 2, 3, 4, 6 degrees. It'll become a planet uninhabitable." And my reaction to that was, although I'd been a science teacher teaching about that, I said, "Beth, you mustn't exaggerate."
And so you thought she was exaggerating?
At that time, I did think she was exaggerating, but the fact that she's a clever girl and we love her made me think I need to go and find out for myself. So I went to NASA, the Royal Society, the Met Office, the IPCC, and after a year of exploring the internet with those bodies in particular, I had to say, "Beth, you're right, it's really urgent."
And so what did you do then when you discovered that? I mean, that's a pretty big discovery after thinking, there is a problem here, to suddenly, this is really urgent.
Yeah, well, my grandson wanted to know where his Auntie Beth had been arrested, and when we told him, age 6, his reaction was to say, "We can fix it." So that was a pretty powerful call to Grandad. You need to get active in campaigning about this sort of thing.
And I know, because you shared with me, that you've had some really great success in campaigning. I wonder if you'd just tell us about one of those incidents, which is the incident with your MP.
Well, the leader of our city council, he had spoken at a prayer breakfast at our cathedral and said that climate change was one of their priorities for the city council, and you could have knocked me down with a feather hearing that. So I went to him and said, "Would you support me going to Leeds to find out about the Leeds Climate Commission with a view to setting up a climate commission in Lincoln?" And his answer was yes. And I went with a team of people from the council, the university, with Siemens, a big engineering company in the city of Lincoln. And to cut a long story short, as a result of that, we now have an active Lincoln Climate Commission doing lots of good stuff.
And that's great. So I think that conversation just highlights that actually there is an urgency here. We need to do something about it, and doing something about it is not always us as individuals, although that's important, but we need to get involved in changing what's going on in our nation, in our world. Those words of Amos, which are the theme of Season of Creation, "Let justice and peace roll," that was spoken to the nation of Israel when they were frankly in a mess. Their leaders had led them in the wrong direction. There was poverty, inequality, immorality rife in the country. But now we know that it's not just one nation, it's the world that's in a mess. And to put that right, we need to do everything we can to let justice and peace roll.